The fire crackled softly in the hearth, sending warm orange light dancing across the walls, and if you had wandered through the narrow streets of London on a cold autumn evening in 1862, you might have passed a young woman named Margaret without giving her a second glance. She was 18 years old, with chestnut hair usually hidden beneath a worn bonnet and hands roughened by years of work. Margaret had been born in a small village far from the city, where the fields stretched beyond the horizon and every face was familiar. Her father had been a carpenter, her mother a seamstress, and though they were never wealthy, there had always been enough bread on the table and enough laughter to make the tiny cottage feel warm. But life has a way of changing quietly at first. A poor harvest came one year, followed by another. Work became scarce. Then Margaret's father fell ill during a bitter winter and never recovered. The little savings the family possessed disappeared faster than anyone expected. By the following spring, Margaret's mother struggled to keep food in the pantry, and every day seemed harder than the last. Like many young women of her time, Margaret heard stories about London. The city was said to be full of opportunities. There were shops, factories, wealthy households in need of servants, and streets crowded with people chasing better lives. To a girl staring out at empty fields and unpaid bills, London sounded almost magical. One chilly morning, carrying a small suitcase and a folded letter from a distant acquaintance who claimed to know of available work, Margaret boarded a coach bound for the capital. Her mother cried as they said goodbye. Though she tried to hide it behind a brave smile, Margaret promised she would send money home as soon as she found employment. She truly believed she would. During the long journey, she imagined herself working in a respectable house, perhaps learning new skills and saving enough to help her family. Yet as the countryside slowly gave way to endless rows of brick buildings and factory chimneys, a feeling she could not explain settled in her chest. London was larger than anything she had ever imagined. The streets seemed endless, the crowds overwhelming, and the smoke hung over the city like a permanent gray cloud. Standing alone at the edge of a busy station, clutching her suitcase, Margaret suddenly realized that she knew no one here. The acquaintance who had written the letter was nowhere to be found. Evening shadows were already stretching across the cobblestones, and for the first time since leaving home, she wondered whether the city of opportunity might also be a city of dangers she had never been taught to see. The fire burned low as the evening deepened, and somewhere beyond the frost-covered windows of London, Margaret stood alone beneath a gas lamp, clutching her suitcase while crowds hurried past without noticing her. The city seemed to move like a great river, carrying thousands of people toward destinations she could only guess at. She waited for the acquaintance mentioned in the letter, but the minutes stretched into hours, and no familiar face appeared. The station slowly emptied. Shopkeepers began lowering their shutters, and a cold wind swept through the narrow streets. Margaret had only a few coins in her pocket, not enough for several nights at an inn. She told herself not to panic, yet fear was beginning to whisper in her thoughts. What if the letter had been a mistake? What if she had traveled all this way for nothing? Just as she was considering whether to spend the night on a bench inside the station, she noticed a woman watching her from across the street. The woman appeared to be in her 40s, dressed in a dark green coat with a fur collar and carrying a small umbrella despite the clear sky. Unlike the hurried strangers passing by, she seemed calm and composed. After a moment, the woman crossed the street and offered Margaret a kind smile. "You look lost, dear," she said gently. Her voice carried none of the harshness Margaret had come to expect from the city. Margaret hesitated, but eventually explained her situation. The woman listened carefully, nodding with concern. "London can be difficult for newcomers," she said, "especially young women arriving alone." She introduced herself as Mrs. Whitmore and explained that she managed a boarding house where respectable young women could stay while searching for employment. The offer sounded almost too fortunate to believe. Margaret felt relief wash over her like warmth from a fire. Perhaps London was not as cruel as it first appeared. Mrs. Whitmore even knew of households seeking maids and seamstresses. She spoke confidently, as though helping girls like Margaret was an ordinary part of her life. With darkness falling and no better options in sight, Margaret accepted the invitation. Together they walked through winding streets illuminated by flickering gas lamps. The city changed as they traveled. The grand buildings near the station gave way to narrower roads and older houses. Yet Mrs. Whitmore chatted pleasantly the entire way, pointing out landmarks and telling stories about London. Eventually, they arrived at a tall brick house tucked between two larger buildings. Warm light glowed from its windows. Laughter drifted faintly from inside. To Margaret, exhausted from travel and uncertainty, it seemed like a safe harbor in a storm. As Mrs. Whitmore opened the door and welcomed her inside, Margaret believed she was stepping toward a brighter future. She did not yet realize that some doors, once crossed, can quietly change the course of a life forever. The fire crackled softly as the night deepened, and Margaret followed Mrs. Whitmore through the warmly lit hallway of the brick house, feeling the tension slowly leave her shoulders for the first time since. Arriving in London, the entrance smelled faintly of lavender and polished wood. A grandfather clock ticked steadily near the staircase, and somewhere deeper in the house she could hear cheerful conversation mixed with occasional laughter. It felt nothing like the frightening city outside. A maid appeared and took Margaret's suitcase upstairs while Mrs. Whitmore guided her into a dining room where several young women sat around a large table. Some were sewing, others reading newspapers or quietly talking among themselves. They smiled politely as Margaret entered. None appeared unhappy. In fact, many seemed far more comfortable than she expected from women living away from home. Tea was served along with fresh bread and warm stew. After spending most of the day worried and hungry, Margaret could hardly believe her luck. Mrs. Whitmore explained that many of the women staying in the house had arrived in London under circumstances similar to her own. Some were searching for domestic work, while others hoped to find positions in shops or textile workshops. Hearing this eased Margaret's fears considerably. She was not alone after all. During supper, she spoke with a girl named Eleanor, who had come from Manchester only a few months earlier. Eleanor seemed friendly and confident, though there was a sadness in her eyes that Margaret could not quite understand. Whenever Margaret asked questions about employment, Eleanor answered politely but often changed the subject before giving many details. At the time, Margaret assumed she was simply tired. After the meal, Mrs. Whitmore showed Margaret to a small but comfortable bedroom on the second floor. A clean bed stood beside a window overlooking the narrow street below. There was a wash basin, a small wardrobe, and even a vase containing fresh flowers. To Margaret, who had feared sleeping on a station bench only hours earlier, the room felt almost luxurious. Before leaving, Mrs. Whitmore assured her that opportunities would be discussed in the morning and encouraged her to get plenty of rest. Once alone, Margaret sat on the edge of the bed and gazed out the window. Gas lamps illuminated the street below, casting golden reflections across the wet cobblestones. For the first time since leaving home, she felt hopeful. She imagined writing a letter to her mother describing the kind woman who had helped her and the comfortable place she had found. Yet as she prepared for sleep, she noticed something curious. Although laughter still drifted from downstairs, she could also hear carriages arriving unusually late into the night. The front door opened and closed repeatedly. Men's voices occasionally echoed in the hallway before fading away. Margaret frowned slightly. It seemed strange for a boarding house to receive so many visitors after dark. But exhaustion soon overcame her questions. Pulling the blanket close, she drifted into sleep, unaware that the answers she sought were already waiting just beyond. The next sunrise, the fire glowed warmly as dawn arrived over London, and Margaret awoke feeling more rested than she had in weeks. Pale morning light filtered through the curtains, softening the outlines of the unfamiliar room. For a few moments she forgot where she was. Then the memories of her journey returned, along with the comforting thought that perhaps her troubles were finally behind her. After dressing, she made her way downstairs, where breakfast was already being served. The dining room was lively but orderly. The young women she had met the previous evening gathered around the table, speaking quietly over tea and toast. Mrs. Whitmore greeted everyone with the same calm smile Margaret had seen before. Yet as the morning passed, Margaret began noticing small details that felt oddly out of place. No one seemed to be leaving for work. She expected the house to empty as the women headed toward shops, factories, or wealthy homes. Instead, they remained inside. Some spent hours reading, others practiced piano in the parlor, and a few sat by the windows sewing delicate garments. It looked more like a finishing school than a boarding house for working women. Curious, Margaret approached Eleanor and asked when the employment interviews would begin. Eleanor hesitated before answering. "Soon," she said quietly. "Mrs. Whitmore likes new arrivals to settle in first." The answer sounded reasonable enough. Yet something in Eleanor's expression suggested there was more she wished to say. Later that afternoon, Margaret explored the house. Most doors were unlocked, but several rooms on the upper floor remained closed. She also noticed that the front entrance was usually monitored by one of the servants. Nobody was forbidden from leaving, yet surprisingly, few residents ventured outside. As evening approached, the atmosphere of the house slowly changed. The women who had spent the day in simple dresses disappeared upstairs. When they returned, many wore elegant gowns far finer than anything Margaret had ever owned. Their hair had been carefully styled, and some wore jewelry that sparkled in the lamplight. Margaret watched in confusion. If they were searching for employment, why would they dress for a grand social event? Before she could ask, Mrs. Whitmore approached her with a reassuring smile. "You needn't worry about work just yet, my dear," she said. "There is plenty of time for that. For now, simply enjoy your stay." The words were kind, yet Margaret felt an unexpected chill. She glanced toward the front windows. Outside, carriages had already begun arriving despite the early hour. Well-dressed gentlemen stepped onto the pavement and entered through the front door. The servants greeted them as though their visits were entirely expected. Laughter echoed from the drawing room. Music soon followed. Margaret stood silently near the staircase, watching the scene unfold. For the first time since arriving at the house, a troubling thought entered her mind. Perhaps this place was not exactly what Mrs. Whitmore had claimed it to be. And if that were true, she wondered what role she, herself, was expected to play in whatever secrets the house was, carefully hiding behind its warm walls and welcoming smiles. The fire hissed softly as a fresh log settled into the flames, and somewhere beyond the warm glow of the hearth, our story returns to Margaret, who spent the next day carrying a growing sense of unease she could no longer ignore. The strange visitors, the elegant gowns, the mysterious routines of the house, none of it resembled the simple boarding house Mrs. Whitmore had described. Throughout the morning, Margaret searched for an opportunity to speak privately with Eleanor. She finally found her sitting, alone in a small sitting room near the back of the house, gazing through a rain-speckled window. The room was quiet except for the ticking of a small mantel clock. Margaret sat beside her and lowered her voice. "Please tell me honestly," she said. "What is this place?" For several seconds, Eleanor remained silent. Her eyes stayed fixed on the gray street outside. Then she sighed heavily, as though carrying a burden she had long wished to set down. "I asked the same question when I arrived," she said softly. Margaret felt her stomach tighten. Eleanor explained that most of the young women who came to the house had arrived under circumstances very similar to her own. They had been promised opportunities, shelter, and respectable work. Some had come from villages, others from factories, and a few had nowhere else to go at all. At first, the house appeared welcoming and generous. Food was provided, rooms were comfortable. New clothing appeared when needed, but gradually the reality became harder to ignore. The wealthy visitors arriving each evening were not business employers. The elegant gatherings downstairs were not social events. The house operated within a hidden world that polite society pretended not to see. Margaret listened in stunned silence. Her heart pounded with disbelief. "Then why don't people simply leave?" she asked. Eleanor's expression darkened. "Some do," she replied, "but many discover they owe money for their lodging, clothing, meals, and other expenses. Others have nowhere to go. Some are afraid. Some convince themselves they will leave next month, then the month after that." Margaret felt as though the floor beneath her had shifted. She remembered her nearly empty purse, the long journey from home, and the family depending on her success. The future she had imagined seemed suddenly distant and fragile. Yet Eleanor quickly added something that surprised her. "No one has locked the doors," she said. "But London can become its own kind of cage when you are alone and penniless." Words lingered in the room long after they were spoken. As evening approached once more, Margaret stood by her bedroom window and watched another line of carriages arrive. The house glowed warmly against the darkness, looking welcoming to anyone passing by. But now she understood that appearances could hide uncomfortable truths. For the first time since arriving in London, Margaret began thinking not about how to build a future here, but whether she should find a way to leave before the city swallowed her hopes entirely. The fire burned steadily as another evening settled over Victorian London, and Margaret sat alone at a small writing desk in her room, staring at a blank sheet of paper. For several days she had carried the same thought in her mind. She needed to write home. Her mother was waiting for news, probably watching the road each afternoon and hoping the postman would bring a letter. Margaret dipped her pen into the ink and began carefully forming the words. She described her arrival in London, the large house where she was staying, and the kindness she had been shown. Yet each sentence felt incomplete. She could not bring herself to describe the growing uncertainty she felt. How could she explain something she barely understood herself? After several attempts, she folded the unfinished letter and placed it inside a drawer. It remained there unsent. As the days passed, Margaret became increasingly aware of how life inside the house truly worked. No one forced the women to smile. No one openly threatened them. Yet there existed an invisible pressure that seemed to surround every corner of the building. New dresses appeared when needed. Meals arrived punctually. Warm rooms sheltered them from London's cold streets. Every comfort carried an unspoken cost. Some of the women spoke openly about leaving one day. Others had stopped talking about it altogether. One rainy afternoon, Margaret found herself standing by a second-floor window beside Eleanor. Together they watched people hurry through the wet streets below. Clerks carrying briefcases, shopkeepers opening doors, laborers pushing carts through puddles. Ordinary lives unfolding beyond the glass. "Do you ever think about leaving?" Margaret asked quietly. Eleanor smiled sadly. "Every day. Then why stay?" Eleanor looked down at the street. Because wanting something and knowing how to reach it are often two different things. The answer lingered in Margaret's thoughts. Long after their conversation ended, that evening she made a decision. She would not allow herself to become comfortable. Comfort, she realized, could be dangerous. It could persuade a person to stop searching for a better path. She began paying closer attention to everything around her. She listened to conversations. She learned which servants were friendly and which avoided questions. She observed when deliveries arrived and when visitors departed. Most importantly, she started looking for opportunities beyond the walls of the house. One morning, she discovered a newspaper left in the sitting room. Hidden among advertisements and announcements were notices seeking clerks, assistants, seamstresses, and domestic workers. The wages were small, but they represented something precious: independence. For the first time since arriving in London, Margaret felt a flicker of determination stronger than fear. The road ahead remained uncertain, and she had little money, few connections, and no clear plan. Yet as she folded the newspaper and slipped it beneath her coat, she realized something important. The city that had trapped so many dreams might also contain a door leading out. She simply had to find it before hope faded entirely. The fire crackled gently in the grate, and as the wind rattled the window panes of old London houses, Margaret found herself holding tighter to the folded newspaper hidden beneath her coat. In those days, dear listener, a newspaper advertisement could mean far more than a few printed words. It could mean a meal, a bed, a future, or the chance to reclaim a life before it slipped away entirely. During the following week, Margaret studied every notice she could find. Whenever a newspaper was left unattended in the sitting room, she quietly examined the pages while others were distracted. Most positions offered little pay. Some required references she did not possess. Others demanded experience she could not honestly claim. Yet she refused to surrender hope. One chilly morning, while fog drifted between the rooftops and horse-drawn carts rattled across the cobblestones below, Margaret discovered an advertisement seeking a junior assistant for a small bookshop near Holborn. The wages were modest, but lodging was not required, and literacy was considered more important than social standing. Her heart quickened as she read the notice twice, then a third time. It was not a perfect opportunity. It was something even better. It was real. That afternoon she shared the discovery with Eleanor. While they sat near a fire in an upstairs parlor, Eleanor listened carefully, then smiled in a way Margaret had not seen before. It was not a sad smile. It was hopeful. "You should try," Eleanor said quietly. "Even if nothing comes of it." Margaret nodded. "Would you leave too if you could?" Eleanor stared into the flames for a long moment. "I think I forgot how to imagine it," she admitted. Those words stayed with Margaret long after their conversation ended. She began to understand that the greatest danger inside the house was not poverty or uncertainty. It was the slow loss of belief that life could ever be different. Meanwhile, Mrs. Whitmore seemed unusually observant. More than once, Margaret noticed the older woman watching her thoughtfully across a room. Yet Mrs. Whitmore said nothing. She neither encouraged nor discouraged Margaret's growing interest in employment. Her silence felt mysterious. One rainy evening, after many visitors had departed and the house had grown quiet, Mrs. Whitmore invited Margaret into her private sitting room. A fire glowed warmly in the hearth, casting soft shadows across shelves lined with books and framed photographs. For several moments, neither woman spoke. Then Mrs. Whitmore folded her hands and looked directly at her. "You have been searching for something," she said calmly. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. She considered denying it, but decided against it. "I have been searching for work," she answered. To her surprise, Mrs. Whitmore did not appear angry. Instead, she looked tired, older somehow. "You remind me of someone I once knew," she said quietly. "A girl who arrived in London, believing determination alone could protect her." The room fell, silent except for the ticking of a clock on the mantel. Margaret sensed there was a story hidden behind those words. But before she could ask, Mrs. Whitmore rose and moved toward the window. Beyond the glass, gas lamps glowed through the fog. "Be careful whom you trust," she said softly. "London offers opportunities, but it also knows how to disguise its dangers." As Margaret left the room that night, she carried more questions than answers. Yet one thing had become certain. Somewhere beyond the walls of the house, a path existed. It might be narrow, it might be difficult, but for the first time since arriving in London, she could almost see its beginning. The fire crackled gently in the grate, and as the wind rattled the window panes of old London houses, Margaret found herself holding tighter to the folded newspaper hidden beneath her coat. In those days, dear listener, a newspaper advertisement could mean far more than a few printed words. It could mean a meal, a bed, a future, or the chance to reclaim a life before it slipped away entirely. During the following week, Margaret studied every notice she could find. Whenever a newspaper was left unattended in the sitting room, she quietly examined the pages while others were distracted. Most positions offered little pay. Some required references she did not possess. Others demanded experience she could not honestly claim. Yet she refused to surrender hope. One chilly morning, while fog drifted between the rooftops and horse-drawn carts rattled across the cobblestones below, Margaret discovered an advertisement seeking a junior assistant for a small bookshop near Holborn. The wages were modest, but lodging was not required, and literacy was considered more important than social standing. Her heart quickened as she read the notice twice, then a third time. It was not a perfect opportunity. It was something even better. It was real. That afternoon she shared the discovery with Eleanor. While they sat near a fire in an upstairs parlor, Eleanor listened carefully, then smiled in a way Margaret had not seen before. It was not a sad smile. It was hopeful. "You should try," Eleanor said quietly. "Even if nothing comes of it," Margaret nodded. "Would you leave too if you could?" Eleanor stared into the flames for a long moment. "I think I forgot how to imagine it," she admitted. Those words stayed with Margaret long after their conversation ended. She began to understand that the greatest danger inside the house was not poverty or uncertainty. It was the slow loss of belief that life could ever be different. Meanwhile, Mrs. Whitmore seemed unusually observant. More than once, Margaret noticed the older woman watching her thoughtfully across a room. Yet Mrs. Whitmore said nothing. She neither encouraged nor discouraged Margaret's growing interest in employment. Her silence felt mysterious. One rainy evening, after many visitors had departed and the house had grown quiet, Mrs. Whitmore invited Margaret into her private sitting room. A fire glowed warmly in the hearth, casting soft shadows across shelves lined with books and framed photographs. For several moments, neither woman spoke. Then Mrs. Whitmore folded her hands and looked directly at her. "You have been searching for something," she said calmly. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. She considered denying it, but decided against it. "I have been searching for work," she answered. To her surprise, Mrs. Whitmore did not appear angry. Instead, she looked tired, older somehow. "You remind me of someone I once knew," she said quietly. "A girl who arrived in London, believing determination alone could protect her." The room fell, silent except for the ticking of a clock on the mantel. Margaret sensed there was a story hidden behind those words. But before she could ask, Mrs. Whitmore rose and moved toward the window. Beyond the glass, gas lamps glowed through the fog. "Be careful whom you trust," she said softly. "London offers opportunities, but it also knows how to disguise its dangers." As Margaret left the room that night, she carried more questions than answers. Yet one thing had become certain. Somewhere beyond the walls of the house, a path existed. It might be narrow, It might be difficult, but for the first time since arriving in London, she could almost see its beginning. The fire glowed warmly against the dark stones of the hearth, and if you listen carefully, dear friend, you can almost hear the distant rumble of carriage wheels rolling through the fog-covered streets of Victorian London. It was the morning after Margaret's conversation with Mrs. Whitmore, and sleep had visited her only briefly. The older woman's warning lingered in her thoughts. London offered opportunities, yes, but it concealed its dangers behind respectable faces and polished doors. Yet for all the uncertainty, Margaret awoke with something she had not felt in many weeks: resolve. The advertisement for the bookshop remained folded carefully inside her pocket. Several times she removed it and read the words again, as though afraid they might disappear. A junior assistant wanted, literacy required, honest character preferred. The pay was small, but to Margaret it seemed like a fortune. More importantly, it represented a future that belonged to her. That afternoon, a rare opportunity arrived. Mrs. Whitmore announced that several of the women would be attending a charitable lecture at a nearby church hall. The outing was entirely voluntary, and for the first time since arriving, Margaret realized she could leave the house without attracting attention. As the group stepped onto the busy street, cold autumn air filled her lungs. London stretched around her in all directions. Gas lamps stood like silent guardians along the pavement. Shop windows gleamed despite the gray weather. Street vendors shouted their wares, while clerks hurried past, carrying ledgers beneath their arms. The city felt enormous, intimidating, and strangely beautiful. When the others entered the church hall, Margaret quietly slipped away. Her heart pounded as she followed the directions listed in the newspaper advertisement. She crossed crowded streets, past rows of brick buildings blackened by coal smoke, and finally arrived at a narrow bookshop, squeezed between a tailor and a tobacconist. The sign above the door creaked gently in the wind. For several moments she simply stood outside, staring at it. Fear whispered that she would be rejected. Hope urged her forward. At last she stepped inside. The scent of paper, leather, and dust filled the air. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling. Behind a wooden counter stood an elderly gentleman with silver, spectacles balanced on his nose. He looked up from a ledger and offered a polite nod. Margaret introduced herself and explained why she had come. The bookseller listened patiently, asking simple questions about her education and experience. She answered honestly. There was no reason to pretend. When the conversation ended, the man folded his hands thoughtfully. "I cannot promise anything," he said. "Several applicants have already inquired about the position." Margaret felt disappointment begin to settle. Then he continued, "But you read well, better than many. Return next Tuesday, and we shall speak again." As she stepped back onto the street, the city seemed somehow brighter despite the clouds. She had not secured the position. She had not escaped her difficulties. Yet she had done something important. She had taken a step beyond the walls that had begun to define her life. That evening, when she returned to the house, Eleanor immediately noticed the change in her expression. Margaret shared everything: the walk, the shop, the interview. For the first time in many months, Eleanor laughed softly and said, "You sound like someone who can already see the door opening." Margaret smiled, though uncertainty remained. The road ahead was still long, but as rain began tapping gently against the windows and the fire crackled downstairs, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps London had not yet finished writing her story. The fire burned steadily as another cold week settled over London, and the city outside seemed wrapped in an endless veil of mist. Gas lamps glowed like distant stars along the wet streets, and horse-drawn carriages rattled through the darkness while thousands of lives crossed paths without ever truly meeting. Inside Mrs. Whitmore's house, Margaret waited anxiously for Tuesday to arrive. Every morning she awoke with the same question. Would the bookseller remember her? Would he choose someone else? Or had she simply allowed herself to hope too much? Waiting, dear listener, can sometimes be harder than hardship itself. To keep her mind occupied, Margaret continued observing everything around her. She noticed how some women measured time not by days, but by opportunities missed. Others spoke often of futures they no longer seemed to believe in. Eleanor, however, had changed slightly. Since hearing about the bookshop, a spark had returned to her eyes. She asked Margaret questions about the city beyond the neighborhood. What did the shops look like? Were there many customers? Did ordinary women really work there? Margaret answered as best she could. and each conversation felt less like dreaming and more like planning. Then, on a gray Monday afternoon, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived. It was addressed to Margaret. For a moment, she simply stared at it. The handwriting was familiar, her mother's. She carried it upstairs and sat beside her bedroom window before carefully breaking the seal. As rain tapped softly against the glass, she began to read. The letter was simple. Her mother wrote about the village, the harvest, and neighbors Margaret had known all her life. She described the cottage, feeling quieter without her daughter there. She mentioned how every letter carrier who passed, the road made her glance toward, the gate with hope. Yet nowhere in the letter was there complaint or self-pity. Instead, Margaret found encouragement. Whatever difficulties you face, her mother had written, remember that courage does not mean never being afraid. It means continuing forward despite fear. By the time Margaret finished reading, tears blurred the ink. For weeks, she had felt isolated, trapped between uncertainty and disappointment. Yet those familiar words reminded her that she still belonged somewhere. She still had people waiting for her. That evening, she finally completed the letter she had abandoned days earlier. She did not reveal every detail about the house. She could not bring herself to cause unnecessary worry. But she wrote honestly about her search for work and her determination to build a future. When she folded the letter and sealed it, she felt lighter than she had in months. The following morning arrived at last. Fog hung thick over the city as Margaret made her way once again toward the little bookshop near Holborn. Every step seemed longer than before. When she reached the door, she hesitated briefly, then entered. The elderly bookseller looked up from his counter and immediately recognized her. For a moment, his expression revealed nothing. Then he closed the ledger before him and smiled faintly. "Miss Margaret," he said, "I was hoping you would return." Margaret felt her heart race. Outside, the city continued moving through the mist, unaware that a single sentence had just changed the course of a young woman's life. And as the old bookseller motioned for her to sit, she sensed that the door she had been searching for was finally beginning to open. The fire crackled softly, and outside the windows the November fog pressed against London like a gray sea. Now, dear listener, before we follow Margaret any further toward the future she longed to build, we must pause for a moment and look more closely at the world she inhabited, for it was a world many people passed every day without truly seeing. Although Margaret had received encouraging news from the bookseller, nothing had changed overnight. She still returned each evening to Mrs. Whitmore's house. She still climbed the same staircase, heard the same grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, and watched the same gas lamps flicker through the curtains after sunset. Life inside the house followed a routine, so steady that newcomers often found it comforting at first. Breakfast was served promptly at 7. Fresh bread, porridge, tea, and occasionally eggs appeared on the table. The women gathered quietly, some still sleepy, others already dressed and prepared for the day. Afterward came cleaning, sewing, mending clothes, reading newspapers, or helping in various parts of the house. To an outsider, it might have resembled an ordinary boarding establishment. Yet Margaret had learned that appearances often concealed deeper truths. Many of the women living there came from backgrounds much like her own. Some had lost fathers in industrial accidents. Others had left overcrowded factories where 14-hour shifts barely provided enough money to survive. One young woman named Clara had worked in a textile mill since the age of 10. Another, Lucy, had spent years as a servant before illness forced her employer to dismiss her without compensation. Victorian London was filled with such stories. Thousands of women arrived, each year hoping for opportunity only to discover that independence was expensive. Rent consumed wages, food prices rose, respectable jobs were limited. Employers frequently preferred experienced workers, yet experience could only be gained by obtaining employment in the first place. It was a cruel circle. Margaret listened carefully whenever the women shared their stories. In the evenings, after visitors departed and the house grew quiet, conversations often became surprisingly honest. Around the fireplace, fears were spoken aloud. Some worried about aging with no savings. Others feared becoming ill. A few still supported family members in distant towns and villages. Nearly everyone carried some burden that the outside world never saw. Eleanor once explained it best. "People think poverty is only about money," she told Margaret one rainy night. "But sometimes poverty means having no safe place to fail." The words stayed with Margaret. During her weeks in London, she had begun noticing details she once overlooked. She saw children sleeping beneath market awnings, She saw laborers limping home after exhausting shifts. She saw widows selling matches on street corners during freezing weather. The city offered extraordinary wealth to a fortunate few, but survival remained a daily struggle for countless others. Even inside Mrs. Whitmore's house, comfort was fragile. Warm rooms and regular meals provided security, yet many women understood how easily those comforts could disappear. Perhaps that was why so few left, not because they lacked courage, but because uncertainty beyond the front door seemed even more frightening. As Margaret lay awake, one evening listening to distant carriage wheels echo through the fog, she thought about every woman sleeping beneath the same roof. Each had once arrived believing London would transform her life. Some dreams had faded, others remained alive. Margaret touched the folded letter from her mother resting beside her bed and stared toward the dark ceiling above. She still did not know whether the bookshop position would become her path forward, but she understood something now that many newcomers never learned until too late. In Victorian London, survival itself required determination, and those who managed to build a new life rarely did so because the city was kind. They succeeded because they refused to stop hoping when every reason to surrender stood directly before them. The fire crackled brightly as the evening shadows stretched across the old walls, and outside, London disappeared beneath another blanket of fog. The city seemed quieter than usual, though thousands of lives continued moving through its narrow streets. Margaret sat near the upstairs window with her mother's letter folded carefully in her lap. Much had changed during the past few weeks. For the first time since arriving in London, she no longer felt completely powerless. The visit to the bookshop had given her something precious, a possibility. Yet possibilities, dear listener, are not the same as certainty. Every day she still woke beneath Mrs. Whitmore's roof. Every evening she still returned to the same house where so many young women waited for futures that never seemed to arrive. The following afternoon, Margaret was summoned unexpectedly to the bookshop. Snow threatened in the gray sky as she hurried through the crowded streets toward Holborn. Her heart raced the entire journey. She feared disappointment almost as much as she desired success. When she entered the narrow shop, the familiar scent of books immediately surrounded her. The elderly bookseller stood behind the counter sorting invoices. This time, however, he did not keep her waiting. "Miss Margaret," he said warmly, "I have made my decision." For a brief moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. "The position is yours if you wish to accept it." Margaret could scarcely believe the words. Relief, excitement, gratitude, and disbelief all arrived at once. She gripped the edge of the counter to steady herself. The bookseller smiled kindly. "The wages are modest," he explained. "The hours are long, but honest work remains honest work." Margaret accepted immediately. Yet as the details were discussed, a new problem emerged. The salary would not begin until the end of her first month. Until then, she would need somewhere to stay and enough money to manage her daily expenses. The realization dimmed her excitement slightly. Independence was closer than ever, but not yet within reach. On her walk back through the city, she found herself studying London with different eyes. She noticed clerks hurrying from offices, women carrying baskets from market stalls, boys selling newspapers beneath gas lamps, and laborers unloading cargo near warehouses. Every person seemed to belong somewhere. Every person appeared connected to a routine, a purpose, a place in the vast machinery of the city. Margaret wanted that feeling more than anything. That evening she shared the news with Eleanor. For several seconds, her friend simply stared at her in astonishment. Then she embraced her tightly. "You did it," Eleanor whispered. "You actually did it." Yet instead of celebrating, Eleanor soon grew quiet. The happiness in her eyes mixed with something else, sadness. Margaret understood why. Her opportunity highlighted how few opportunities existed for everyone else. Later that night, as rain tapped softly against the windows, Margaret sat alone in the drawing room. The fire burned low. Most of the house had gone to sleep. She was thinking about the future when Mrs. Whitmore entered unexpectedly. The older woman carried a small ledger beneath one arm. Without a word, she sat opposite Margaret and studied the flames. Several moments passed before she finally spoke. "I heard about the position." Margaret looked up nervously. Mrs. Whitmore nodded slowly. "You have worked hard to find your own path." Her voice contained neither criticism nor approval. Then she opened the ledger, removed a folded document, and placed it on the table between them. "There is something you should know before you leave," Margaret stared at the paper, suddenly aware that whatever was written, there might change everything. She believed about the house, about Mrs. Whitmore, and perhaps even about her own future. The fire crackled softly as the older woman waited for her to unfold the page. The fire crackled softly as Margaret reached for the folded document resting on the table between herself and Mrs. Whitmore. Outside, rain whispered against the windows, and the distant rumble of carriage wheels echoed through the fog-covered streets. For a long moment she simply stared at the paper, afraid that whatever it contained might destroy the fragile hope she had worked so hard to build. Finally she unfolded it. The document was older than she expected. The edges had yellowed with age, and the ink had faded slightly. At first glance, it appeared to be nothing more than a collection of names, dates, and financial records. Yet, as Margaret read more carefully, confusion gave way to surprise. Many of the names belonged to women who had once lived in the house years before. Beside each name were notes describing money that had been lent to them, expenses that had been covered, and in many cases, debts that had later been erased entirely. Margaret looked up in disbelief. "I don't understand," she said, quietly. Mrs. Whitmore remained silent for several seconds before answering. "Most people believe they understand this house," she said. "Very few actually do." The older woman leaned back in her chair, watching the flames dance within the fireplace. For the first time since Margaret had met her, she seemed tired. Not physically tired, but burdened by memories she rarely shared. She explained that decades earlier she had arrived in London under circumstances not unlike Margaret's own. She had known hunger, she had known fear, she had learned how quickly society judged young women who had nowhere to turn. "The city is full of respectable people," she said softly, "many of whom have never had to choose between dignity and survival." Margaret listened carefully. The house, Mrs. Whitmore admitted, had never been a place of simple kindness, but neither had it been entirely what outsiders imagined. Over the years, she had quietly helped dozens of women leave and begin new lives elsewhere. Some became shopkeepers. Others found work as governesses, seamstresses, or companions. A few had even married and started families of their own. "Then why keep records?" Margaret asked. Mrs. Whitmore smiled faintly. "Because one day I hoped someone would ask." The answer puzzled Margaret at first, but slowly she began to understand. The ledger was not a record of debts. It was a record of second chances, names that history would otherwise forget. Women who had survived difficult chapters and found a way forward. Yet one page near the back caught Margaret's attention. Unlike the others, it contained a recent entry, Eleanor's name. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. Beside it was a note written only a few months earlier. The details were brief, but one sentence stood out. "Assistance pending. Opportunity identified." Margaret looked up immediately. Mrs. Whitmore nodded before she could even ask the question. "You are not the only one searching for a way out," she said. Suddenly the future seemed larger than Margaret had imagined. Perhaps her own escape was not the end of the story. Perhaps it was only the beginning of something that could change another life as well. As the fire glowed warmly and the rain continued falling beyond the windows, Margaret realized that the secrets of the house were far more complicated than she had ever believed. The fire burned brightly in the hearth as winter settled fully over London, wrapping the city in cold fog and icy rain. Margaret left Mrs. Whitmore's house only a few days after their conversation, carrying a small suitcase, several carefully folded dresses, and more uncertainty than she cared to admit. The bookseller had helped her secure a modest room above a baker's shop, several streets from the store. It was hardly luxurious. The ceiling slanted sharply beneath the roof. The walls were thin enough to hear every cough from neighboring rooms, and the single window rattled whenever the wind swept through the alley outside. Yet when Margaret closed the door on her first evening there, she felt something she had not experienced since leaving her village, the quiet satisfaction of belonging to herself. Freedom, however, proved less comfortable than she had imagined. The room had no fireplace of its own. Heat drifted upward only weakly from the bakery below. On particularly cold mornings, frost formed delicate patterns along the inside of the window pane. Margaret often woke before dawn, pulling on layers of clothing before climbing from bed. Water left overnight in a wash basin sometimes developed a thin layer of ice. There were no servants bringing breakfast, no prepared meals waiting downstairs. Every penny mattered now. She quickly learned how carefully working people counted their expenses. Bread, tea, coal, lamp oil, laundry, rent, each demanded its share of her modest earnings. At the bookshop the days were long but satisfying. She arrived shortly after sunrise and frequently worked until darkness covered the streets. The shop attracted a remarkable variety of customers. Clerks searching for accounting manuals, lawyers purchasing legal volumes, teachers ordering textbooks, and occasionally wealthy gentlemen who collected rare editions. Margaret spent hours dusting shelves, organizing deliveries, wrapping purchases in brown paper, and helping customers locate titles hidden among hundreds of books. She loved every moment of it. Yet life outside the shop offered daily reminders of how difficult London could be. Each morning she passed children selling newspapers in freezing weather. Some were no older than 10. Factory workers hurried toward mills before dawn. Women carried baskets through muddy streets, often balancing work, household responsibilities, and the care of entire families. One evening, Margaret saw a line of laborers gathered outside a warehouse, hoping to be selected for a day's work. Those who were chosen smiled with relief. Those left behind simply walked away in silence. Such scenes became common. Victorian London was a city of opportunity, but opportunity rarely arrived equally. As Christmas approached, snow finally began to fall. The city looked beautiful beneath its white blanket. Gas lamps glowed like golden stars through the fog. Shop windows displayed holiday decorations. Choirs occasionally sang in churchyards. Yet beneath the beauty remained hardship. Coal prices rose during cold weather. Food cost more. Illness spread quickly through crowded neighborhoods. Margaret often thought about the women she had left behind. She especially worried about Eleanor. On Christmas Eve, sitting alone beneath the weak glow of her oil lamp, she opened a fresh sheet of paper and began writing a letter. Not to her mother this time, to Eleanor, because Margaret had begun to understand something important about freedom. Sometimes escaping is only the first step. The harder task is finding a way to help others follow the same path. The fire glowed warmly as another winter evening settled over London, and outside Margaret's small attic window, snow drifted silently between rows of chimneys and gas lamps. Nearly a year had passed since she first arrived. In the city, carrying little more than hope and a worn suitcase, life remained difficult, but it was now a difficulty she understood. Each morning she rose before sunrise, lit her lamp, dressed quickly in the cold room, and descended the narrow stairs above the bakery. The scent of fresh bread greeted her long before dawn touched the rooftops. By now the baker nodded to her like an old friend. Such small gestures mattered more than most people realized. In a city as vast as London, familiarity itself was a form of wealth. At the bookshop, Margaret had become indispensable. She knew where nearly every volume rested upon the crowded shelves. Regular customers greeted her by name. The elderly bookseller trusted her with accounts, deliveries, and correspondence. For the first time in her life, she was building something that belonged entirely to her own efforts. Yet even as stability slowly entered her life, she could not forget those she had left behind. She exchanged letters with Eleanor whenever possible. The letters traveled slowly through the city, but each one brought reassurance. Eleanor remained at Mrs. Whitmore's house, though circumstances were changing. According to her latest letter, Mrs. Whitmore had quietly begun helping. Several women find employment. Beyond the house, some worked in laundries. Others had found positions as assistants, companions, or seamstresses. Progress was slow, but it was real. One snowy afternoon, as Margaret sorted a stack of newly delivered books, the bookseller handed her an envelope. "This arrived for you," he said. Margaret immediately recognized the handwriting. It belonged to her mother. Smiling, she slipped the letter into her apron pocket and waited until evening to open it. Later, sitting beside her lamp in the attic room, she carefully unfolded the pages. Her mother's words filled her with warmth. The family cottage still stood. The village remained much the same. Yet one passage caught her attention. An elderly neighbor had recently shared a story about Margaret's father that she had never heard before. Years before his death, during a difficult season, he had been offered an opportunity to leave the village and seek better fortunes elsewhere. The offer promised greater wages and easier living. Yet he had declined. According to the neighbor, he believed that a person's worth came not from escaping hardship, but from helping others endure it. Margaret read the sentence several times. The room seemed unusually quiet afterward. Outside, snow continued falling against the window. She thought about Eleanor. She thought about Mrs. Whitmore. She thought about the countless faces she passed each day in London's crowded streets. For months, her goal had been simple: survive, then escape, then build a better life. But now another possibility entered her mind. Perhaps freedom carried responsibilities of its own. Perhaps the purpose of finding a path forward was not merely to walk it alone. As the firelight flickered and the city settled into sleep beyond the rooftops, Margaret folded the letter carefully and placed it beside her bed. For the first time, she began wondering not where her future might lead her, but who she might bring along with her when she arrived there. The fire burned warmly as another evening settled over London, and if you listen closely, dear listener, you can almost hear the distant clip-clop of horses upon wet cobblestones and see the golden glow of gas lamps shining through the fog. It had been nearly 2 years since Margaret first arrived in the city, frightened, alone, and uncertain whether she would even find a place to sleep. Now she stood behind the counter of the bookshop on a quiet spring afternoon, helping a young girl select her first novel. The shop had become more than employment. It had become a home of sorts. The elderly bookseller had grown fond of Margaret and trusted her completely. Customers often sought her advice. Some came only to purchase books, while others seemed to visit simply to exchange a few friendly words. In a city as large as London, kindness was often rarer than money. Yet Margaret's greatest achievement lay beyond the shelves and stacks of books. Her correspondence with Eleanor had continued throughout the long winter. Then one bright morning in April, a familiar figure appeared outside the shop window. Margaret looked up and nearly dropped the ledger she was carrying. There stood Eleanor. For a moment neither woman moved. Then both rushed toward the door. The reunion was filled with laughter, tears, and relief. Eleanor had finally secured a position with a dressmaker. The wages were modest, and the work was exhausting. But it was honest and independent. More importantly, it was hers. Over tea that evening, Eleanor shared news from Mrs. Whitmore's house. Change was coming slowly, but it was coming. Several women had found employment elsewhere. Others were saving money for new beginnings. Even Mrs. Whitmore herself seemed different. Age had softened her priorities. The ledger of names continued to grow, not as a record of debts, but as a record of women who had managed to build new lives. As months turned into years, Margaret became known for helping young women who arrived in London much as she once had. She offered practical advice. She recommended trustworthy employers. She warned newcomers about false promises and easy answers. She could not solve every problem. No one could. Victorian London remained a difficult place. Poverty still haunted many streets. Children still worked long hours. Illness still visited crowded neighborhoods. Life remained unfair in countless ways. Yet Margaret had learned something her younger self could never have imagined. One person's kindness could alter the course of another person's life. Sometimes that kindness was a warm meal. Sometimes it was a letter. Sometimes it was simply believing that someone deserved a second chance. Years later, when people asked how she had survived those difficult early days, Margaret rarely spoke about fear. She rarely spoke about hardship. Instead, she spoke about hope. Hope that arrived disguised as opportunity. Hope that survived disappointment. Hope that refused to disappear even when circumstances suggested it should. And so, dear listener, our story comes to an end. Not because life became perfect. Not because every problem was solved, but because Margaret discovered what so many people spend their entire lives, searching for: purpose, friendship, dignity, and a place where she truly belonged. Outside, the fog still drifts through London's streets. The gas lamps still glow in our imagination, and somewhere perhaps another young dreamer is arriving in the city with a worn suitcase and hopes for a better future. May they find their own light in the darkness, just as Margaret found hers. Thank you for spending this evening beside the fire and listening to this Victorian tale. If you enjoy cozy stories from the Victorian era, forgotten histories, quiet lives, and warm fireside storytelling, be sure to subscribe, follow along, and return for another journey into the past. Until next time, keep the fire burning, keep a good book nearby, and may your evenings always be filled with warmth and wonder.